In 2019, a man in eastern Tennessee submitted a DNA sample, expecting to find exactly what his family had always told him. Scots-Irish, maybe a little Cherokee. That was the story. That was always the story in the mountains. What came back shook him. Sub-Saharan African ancestry, Iberian Peninsula markers, haplogroups that traced back to populations his family had spent generations pretending did not exist. He was not alone. Across Appalachia, tens of thousands of people have opened their DNA results in the last decade and found the same thing. The story they were told does not match the blood they carry. 4 ancestries converge in those mountains in ways that American history has never cleanly explained. Cherokee, Scots-Irish, Melungeon, Portuguese, each one hidden for different reasons. Each one traceable if you know where to look. This is not a story about distant cousins and trace percentages. This is about identity that was buried deliberately, under racial laws, under shame, under survival. The mountains of Appalachia did not just shelter people from the outside world. They sheltered secrets. And those secrets are written in your DNA right now. If you have Appalachian ancestry, stay with me, because what I am about to show you will completely reframe what you thought you knew about where you came from. The Appalachian Mountains run like a spine down the eastern side of North America. From southern Quebec all the way to northern Alabama, roughly 1,500 miles of ridges, hollows, and river valleys that for centuries functioned less like terrain and more like a wall. To the east, the coastal elite, plantation owners, port cities, British colonial law, and the rigid racial categories that law enforced. To the west, the frontier, unknown, dangerous, and largely ungoverned. The mountains sat between those two worlds, and the people who settled there existed in the gap. That geography is not incidental to this story. It is the story. When populations get isolated by terrain, their genetics do something predictable. They mix inward. They intermarry within the same hollows, the same creek systems, the same ridge communities for generations. Outside blood comes in slowly, in small amounts, through traders, through war, through necessity. What you get after 2 or 3 centuries of that process is a population that carries extraordinary genetic complexity inside a relatively small geographic footprint. The Blue Ridge, the Smokies, the Cumberland Plateau, the Clinch River Valley. These were not just beautiful landscapes, they were genetic containers. The 4 bloodlines this video is about did not accidentally end up in the same mountains. They were pushed there, pulled there, or born there across centuries of American history. And once they arrived, the mountains made sure they stayed close enough to leave marks on each other. Marks that are still readable today inside your DNA results, if you know what you are looking at. Before any settler crossed the Blue Ridge, before any Scots-Irish family loaded a wagon in Pennsylvania, before any colonial Virginia court wrote the word Melungeon into a legal record, the Cherokee were already there. They had been there for a long time. Archaeological evidence and Cherokee oral tradition both point to a human presence in the southern Appalachian highlands, going back nearly 12,000 years. The mountains were not wilderness waiting to be discovered. They were home. The Cherokee called themselves Ani Yunwia, the principal people, and in the southern Appalachians, that name was accurate. Their territory covered an enormous swath of what is now North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, and Alabama. They were not scattered bands. They were a sophisticated society organized around matrilineal clans, meaning ancestry and identity passed through the mother's line. 7 clans: wolf, deer, bird, paint, blue, wild potato, and long hair. Your clan determined who you could marry, who you owed loyalty to, and where you stood in Cherokee society. Their villages sat along river bottoms and mountain streams, positioned deliberately for access to water, fertile soil, and trade routes. They cultivated corn, beans, and squash. They built council houses where decisions were made collectively. Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto encountered ancestral Cherokee communities in the 1540s and documented what he found. A settled, organized, deeply rooted people. The Cherokee did not drift into the Appalachians. They evolved there. Their language, their governance, their spiritual relationship with the land, all of it developed in those specific mountains over thousands of years. When the settlers came, they were not arriving in empty territory. They were arriving in the Cherokee's backyard, and what happened next changed the genetic makeup of Appalachia forever. In the winter of 1838 and 1839, the United States Army forced between 16,000 and 18,000 Cherokee people out of their ancestral homeland at gunpoint. They marched them west to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. The journey covered roughly 800 miles. An estimated 4,000 people died on the way. History calls it the Trail of Tears. What history talks about less is who stayed. Not everyone went. A group of Cherokee families in the mountains of western North Carolina refused removal or evaded the soldiers entirely, hiding in the deep hollows and high ridges that had sheltered their people for generations. A white man named William Holland Thomas, the adopted son of Cherokee chief Yonaguska, purchased roughly 50,000 acres of land on their behalf, because at the time, Cherokee people could not legally own property. That land became the Qualla boundary. Today, approximately 10,000 members of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians still live there, in the Smoky Mountains, direct descendants of the people who never left. But the Eastern Band is only part of the Cherokee genetic story in Appalachia. Before and after removal, Cherokee individuals intermarried with Scots-Irish settlers, with free people of color, with traders and frontiersmen who lived on the edges of Cherokee territory for decades. Those marriages produced children who grew up inside settler communities, carrying Cherokee ancestry that was rarely recorded and often actively concealed. Census records from the 1800s show families shifting racial classification between decades. Cherokee one generation, white the next. The blood did not disappear. It went underground. Today, that ancestry shows up in Appalachian DNA results as Native American markers, often small percentages that testing companies struggle to pinpoint precisely. But the haplogroups are there. The Cherokee blood that stayed left fingerprints. In 1607, King James I of England needed a solution to Ireland. The Gaelic clans of Ulster in the north had been resisting British rule for decades. His answer was the plantation of Ulster. He seized land from the native Irish and handed it to Presbyterian settlers from the Scottish lowlands, people who would work the land, spread Protestantism, and hold the territory for the crown. It worked in the short term, but it created a people who belonged nowhere. The Scots-Irish, as they would come to be called, were Scottish enough to be resented in Ireland and Irish enough to be looked down on in Scotland. When crop failures, high rents, and religious persecution made Ulster unlivable in the early 1700s, they left. They came to America by the tens of thousands. Historians estimate that more than 200,000 Ulster emigrants crossed the Atlantic during the 18th century. Most landed in Philadelphia. Colonial authorities were happy to see them, not out of generosity, but out of strategy. The Scots-Irish had a reputation for toughness and a total indifference to authority. They were recruited specifically to settle the frontier, to push into the backcountry, and act as a buffer between the established coastal colonies and the Native American nations to the west. The Scots-Irish followed a route called the Great Wagon Road, a 700-mile path that ran from Philadelphia south through the Shenandoah Valley and into the Carolinas. It had originally been a Cherokee trading path. By the 1750s, it was the busiest road in colonial America. At its southern end, the road ran directly into the Appalachian Mountains. The Scots-Irish kept going. By the time of the American Revolution, estimates suggest at least 250,000 Scots-Irish lived in the American colonies. A significant portion of them were already deep in the mountains. When the Scots-Irish moved into the Appalachian Mountains, they did not just bring themselves, they brought an entire world with them. A world that would become so embedded in the mountains that most people today assume it was always there. Start with the music. The ballads and fiddle tunes that Scots-Irish immigrants carried from Ulster and the Scottish lowlands took root in the hollows of Appalachia and never left. They evolved slowly over generations, blending with African musical traditions brought by enslaved and free black neighbors, absorbing the banjo, an instrument of African origin, into a fundamentally Celtic framework. What came out of that process was Appalachian folk music. And what came out of that was bluegrass. And what came out of that was country music. Every time you hear a fiddle break in a Nashville recording, you are hearing something that traces back directly to the Scots-Irish settlers of the 18th century. Then there is the whiskey. The Scots-Irish brought their distilling knowledge with them from Ulster, where illicit whiskey making had been a tradition for centuries. In the mountains, they applied that knowledge to corn instead of barley and produced what Appalachians called corn liquor. When the federal government tried to tax it in 1791, the Scots-Irish led the Whiskey Rebellion. They lost the political fight but kept the stills. Moonshine is a direct cultural inheritance from Ulster. The language left marks too. The distinct Appalachian dialect, the cadences, certain pronunciations, the vocabulary, carries fingerprints of 17th century Scottish and Irish speech, phrases preserved in the mountains that died out everywhere else. The Scots-Irish also brought their fierce Presbyterian independence, their deep distrust of outside authority, and their intense loyalty to family and clan. Those values did not dilute over time. They calcified. They became the backbone of Appalachian identity. Here is where the story takes a turn that most people completely miss. For generations, a significant number of Appalachian families with dark complexions, ambiguous features, and complicated ancestry claimed one specific identity when anyone asked about their background: Portuguese. Not Cherokee, not African, Portuguese. That answer was not random. It was calculated. In the antebellum South, racial classification was not just a social category, it was a legal one. It determined whether you could own land, testify in court, vote, or remain free. Mixed-race families who could not pass as purely white needed an alternative explanation for their appearance. Portuguese worked. It was European enough to create legal ambiguity. It explained dark skin without invoking African ancestry. And in a world where your racial classification could be challenged in court by a neighbor who wanted your land, ambiguity was survival. The strategy was so common that researchers studying Appalachian genealogy found entire family lines listed as Portuguese on census records who had no documented Iberian ancestry whatsoever. Jack Goins, a researcher who spent 40 years investigating Melungeon history and whose own relatives were listed as Portuguese on the 1880 census, described his shock when his DNA came back, showing no Portuguese ancestry at all. The Portuguese claim was a shield, not a bloodline. Before I show you the last part of this, if you want to look at your own results and see where Melungeon, Cherokee, Scots-Irish, or Portuguese ancestry fits into your bloodline, I put a full 3-volume PDF bundle over at the OriginDNA website. It shows you how to read your raw data and find matches beyond what Ancestry or 23andMe tell you. Link is in the description. But stay right here, because what comes next is the part most people completely miss. But here is the part that makes it complicated. Not every Portuguese claim in Appalachian family trees was invented. There was a real Portuguese presence in colonial America, and it entered the bloodlines of Appalachian families in ways that are genuinely traceable. The first documented Portuguese person to live in colonial America was a man named Matthias de Sousa, recorded in Maryland in 1634. He was likely of mixed African and Sephardic Jewish Portuguese background, arrived as an indentured servant, and eventually became a trader and interpreter. He was not an anomaly. Portugal had been the dominant maritime power of the 15th and early 16th centuries. Portuguese explorers charted the Atlantic coast of North America decades before permanent English settlement began. Portuguese sailors, merchants, and fishermen worked the waters off the American coast throughout the colonial period. Small numbers settled, particularly in New England coastal communities, but also filtered into the mid-Atlantic colonies. Sephardic Jews fleeing the Inquisition, many of them Portuguese or of Portuguese descent, established themselves in early American port cities. Their descendants moved inland over generations. The oldest synagogue in the United States, the Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, is named after Isaac Touro, a Portuguese Jew. That Iberian Sephardic thread is real, and it is present in American ancestry in ways that DNA testing is only now beginning to map precisely. Some Melungeon families who claimed Portuguese descent were not entirely fabricating the story. They may have had one genuine Iberian ancestor, several generations back, real enough to have passed down the claim, too diluted to show clearly on a standard ethnicity estimate. The Portuguese blood in Appalachia is smaller than the legend suggests, but it is not zero, and that distinction matters when you are trying to read your own results honestly. Sometime in the early 1800s, possibly before, a word started appearing in court records, newspaper articles, and census documents along the Tennessee and Virginia border. Melungeon. It was used as a slur, applied to roughly 40 families concentrated in the Clinch River Valley, particularly around Newman's Ridge in Hancock County, Tennessee. The people it was applied to denied it. When pressed on their background, they said they were Portuguese, or Indian, or anything that created enough ambiguity to keep them legally classified as something other than black in a state where black meant enslaved or severely restricted. The physical descriptions that outsiders wrote down were consistent. Olive skin, dark hair, high cheekbones, features that did not fit neatly into the racial categories that 19th century America insisted on. A newspaper account from 1840 described one Melungeon man as half Negro and half Indian. That description alone tells you how much racial anxiety these communities provoked simply by existing. The word itself likely derives from the French-rooted Latin verb miscere, meaning to mix. Some researchers connect it to the French word mélange. Others trace possible roots to West African languages. What it meant in practice was this: you are mixed. You do not belong in our categories. And in antebellum America, that was a dangerous thing to be. The Melungeon communities were not randomly scattered. They moved together, migrating from colonial Virginia through the Piedmont of North Carolina and into the mountains of East Tennessee, staying close to each other across generations, because marrying outside the community carried legal risk. Free people of color who married whites faced fines and expulsion under Virginia law as early as 1691. So these families turned inward. They farmed the ridgetops that white settlers did not want. They built tight communities on the least desirable land, and they survived. For over a century, the origin of the Melungeon families was debated, romanticized, and mythologized. Portuguese sailors shipwrecked on the Carolina coast, Turkish slaves brought over by Sir Francis Drake, lost colonists from Roanoke, ancient Phoenicians who migrated through the Mediterranean and eventually reached Appalachia. Every theory was more exotic than the last, and every theory shared one feature in common. None of them were African. In 2012, that changed. Researcher Roberta Estes led a peer-reviewed DNA study published in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy that analyzed Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA from families historically identified as Melungeon. The results were unambiguous. The families historically called Melungeon are the offspring of sub-Saharan African men and white women of Northern or Central European origin. The haplogroups did not point to Portugal. They did not point to Turkey or the Ottoman Empire. They pointed to colonial Virginia, to the period before race-based slavery hardened into law, when black and white indentured servants lived and worked side by side, formed relationships, and had children together. Estes and her team theorized that the various Melungeon family lines descended from those early mixed unions in Virginia, formed before the 1691 laws that banned interracial marriage and expelled free mixed-race people from the colony. As those laws tightened, the families moved together, westward through North Carolina, then into the Tennessee mountains, staying close because their legal status depended on community solidarity. The Portuguese claim was confirmed by the study to be a legal strategy. And 1874 Tennessee court case documented a Melungeon woman's attorney successfully arguing that his client descended from ancient Phoenicians who had migrated to Portugal and then to America, saving her inheritance by keeping her legally white. The DNA tells a different story, a more American one that makes perfect sense once you understand what survival required. So, what does all of this look like inside your actual DNA results today? That is the question that matters. And the honest answer is that standard ethnicity estimates from Ancestry or 23andMe will often miss or misrepresent every single one of these bloodlines in ways that are frustrating if you do not know why it happens. Start with Cherokee Ancestry. DNA testing companies struggle with Native American ancestry more than almost any other category. The reference populations they use are limited. Small percentages of Native American DNA, anything below roughly 5%, frequently get absorbed into broader categories or disappear entirely from your ethnicity estimate. Someone with a Cherokee great-great-grandparent may show 0 Native American on their results. The ancestry is there. The test is not sensitive enough to find it at that generational distance. Scots-Irish ancestry presents a different problem. It shows up as British and Irish, which is accurate as far as it goes, but it tells you nothing about whether your British-Irish ancestry came through the Ulster Scots migration specifically. To identify Scots-Irish heritage precisely, you need to look at specific haplogroups, particularly R1b variants, common in the Scottish Lowlands and Ulster, and cross-reference them with geographic clustering tools that Ancestry and 23andMe both offer, but most people never use. Melungeon ancestry is the most hidden of all. Because Melungeon families were triracial, their descendants today may show up as partially African, partially European, partially Native American, with no obvious clustering and no family story that connects those pieces. The sub-Saharan African haplogroups that Roberta Estes identified in the 2012 study, particularly certain E1b1a Y chromosome lineages, are the clearest signal to look for in raw data. Portuguese and Iberian ancestry shows up under Iberian Peninsula or Spanish and Portuguese categories, but trace amounts often get reassigned to British or broadly European. Your raw data file is where the real information lives. The ethnicity estimate is the surface. The haplogroups, the chromosome segments, the cousin matches. That is where these 4 bloodlines actually reveal themselves. The Appalachian Mountains kept secrets better than anywhere else in America. The terrain made sure of it. When you live on a ridge that nobody else wants, when you farm the hollow that the lowland families passed over, when your community survives by staying tight and staying quiet, the outside world stops asking questions. For generations, that silence looked like isolation. What it actually was is complexity. 4 bloodlines, Cherokee families who had lived in those mountains for 12,000 years before anyone else arrived. Scots-Irish settlers who crossed an ocean and walked 700 miles down a wagon road to get there. Melungeon communities who built entire survival strategies around hiding what their DNA was carrying. And a Portuguese thread, part legend, part law, part genuine Iberian ancestry woven into the fabric in ways that are still being untangled. None of these 4 stories is separate. They happened in the same hollows, along the same creek beds, across the same ridge lines, bleeding into each other across centuries in ways that no census category ever captured cleanly. That is what Appalachian ancestry actually is. Not one thing, Not a simple origin, a convergence. And if your family came from those mountains, that convergence is written in your blood right now. Standard DNA tests will show you the edges of it. Your raw data will show you more. The story your family told you will explain some of it, and the history that got left out of most textbooks will explain the rest. If you made it this far, subscribe. Next week, I am breaking down the specific haplogroups that appear most often in Appalachian ancestry results and showing you exactly where to find them in your raw data. That video is already being built. Do not miss it.
Thanks for watching this video, but before you go, don't let your DNA results just sit there unanswered. Tap the link on the description to download your ebook and find out what your raw data is hiding.